This lecture deals with the presidency of Richard Nixon. So we've talked about Nixon a little bit in the past. He is originally from California. He grew up to become a lawyer, a representative, and eventually a senator. He was also VP under Eisenhower's 2 terms. And he was a big anti-communist senator and eventually vice president. And he runs for the presidency against John F. Kennedy in 1960 and loses. But he comes back in 1968 and is successful against Eugene McCarthy. So Nixon represents kind of a backlash against a lot of the liberalism that had been happening in the 1960s, especially concerning social issues. So part of it is he runs on ending the Vietnam War. He is not for all the social unrest and the protest, violent and peaceful, that occurred during the Vietnam War. He does not like the Warren Court, who was talking about Miranda versus Arizona and giving more ensuring rights, in his view, for criminals. Other people would say for all American citizens, and taxes that only helped poor minorities under the Great Society. So this is really a backlash against that Great Society. So he comes up with this term that he represents the silent majority, which is the group of Americans that were probably against the Vietnam War but would not protest because he believed a lot of those protests were kind of anti-American. He is elected with a Democratic-controlled Congress, which limits his domestic policy power, and he's going to have to make several compromises with Congress. So he's going to increase Social Security benefits. He expands Job Corps, which was a Great Society program, and he also establishes the Environmental Protection Agency as the environmentalism movement is coming to prominence, and OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, to ensure that workplaces were safe. So he has to take some liberal policies to enact to get Congress to do other things that he wants to do, especially on a foreign policy scale. So some people believed that Nixon's presidency appealed to the unblack, unyoung, and unpoor, otherwise known as white, older, and wealthy, and that kind of becomes the tag of Republicans. And that's not necessarily true, but he gets that backlash from not supporting several civil rights legislations. He did not get the majority of the youth vote, and several of his policies will try to influence or help out the wealthy. His major domestic policy is called New Federalism, which was basically the idea that the federal government has gotten too far involved and we need to roll it back. That more revenue should be shared between the states, and they get to decide where that money goes rather than the federal government deciding. And welfare reform. Get rid of some of the Great Society programs, cut them back, and require work or you would lose welfare. So if you were receiving welfare benefits, that you should have to provide evidence of attempting to get a job or working to continue to receive those benefits. So Nixon comes to the presidency at a time where there's some backlash against the civil rights movement as well. People feeling like the federal government got involved too much. And in his campaign in 1968, his campaign advisors tell him to use the Southern strategy, where he would go after discontented Southern white voters who felt that civil rights had taken up too much of the Democratic ticket and that it should be kind of not as much of a federal issue. He was a cautious conservative, so he delayed segregation or desegregation plans, and he opposed extending the Voting Rights Act of 1965, again on the grounds that it was too much federal government intervention. So also during his tenure of office, the 26th Amendment is passed in 1971, and it gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. Democrats are more supportive of it because at this point they are drawing more of the younger person's vote, and Republicans oppose it. However, in the first presidential election that 18-year-olds can vote in, only about a quarter of them vote. By 2004, we see a big decline in the voting of 18-year-olds, and that's often because they seem disenchanted, and we'll see through the Watergate scandal, through the Pentagon Papers, we see that the federal government isn't as respected, so they kind of feel like it's not benefiting them oftentimes. So Nixon also comes to office at a time where the economy is starting to slow down. We get this new term called stagflation, which meant that unemployment was stagnant. It wasn't really moving. We weren't able to decrease it. And there was also inflation. So a lot of people weren't able to work. And they also had higher prices for things. This is partially caused by the deficit spending of the Kennedy and Johnson administration. But there's also more international trade competition. There's more emerging economies that are producing more things. We are getting out of, we're starting to transfer out of a manufacturing economy, getting more into a service economy. We have a flood of new workers. So as women enter the workforce more because of inflation, we need a two-income household. That's more competition domestically for jobs. We also have so many baby boomers that are coming of age, young people who are looking for work. Add to that we have a foreign oil costs are going up, and eventually a crisis with an organization called OPEC, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and in 1973 there's a war called the Yom Kippur War where Israel attacks Egypt and Syria. We are always going to be proponents of whatever kind of Israel is doing, so we help Israel, and OPEC, which Syria and Egypt were members of, decides to put in an oil embargo against us, so they will not sell us oil. So as this oil embargo goes on, 1 year later, oil is 4 times more expensive than it was, which is causing that inflation. So it affects everything. So any sort of transportation cost or anything that petroleum is used for increases everything, as the unemployment rate is not really being knocked down, which makes things doubly as bad. So we start to look for ways for how to avoid this oil crisis. So we start looking for more domestic production. So we build the Alaskan pipeline, and Nixon imposes a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit on all international highways, so that we can kind of use fuel more efficiently. It also leads to a bigger push for foreign cars, especially Japanese cars, Toyota and Honda, because they're very fuel efficient. So Americans will start getting out of the larger cars that Ford and Chevy were making and into more foreign car production, which again is great for fuel efficiency and trade, but it also hurts domestic car production, which is a big source of jobs in the country. So now we'll get into Nixon's foreign policy. He has a foreign policy advisor named Henry Kissinger, and he is one of the big advocates of of a plan called Realpolitik, which is this German political philosophy that basically said foreign policy should be based on power, not ideals or moral implications. So getting out of moral diplomacy from Woodrow Wilson and talking more about we need to make sure that we use our power against countries that have power as well. So we should use practical politics is kind of what it translates as, and nations would do whatever was in their best interest, so we need to make what we want them to do in their best interest. So we're going to play some nations against each other to get what we want out of them. So Nixon is one of the first American president, or the first American president to visit China, and there's 25 years of hostility between the United States and China after they fall to communism, but Nixon is trying to open up relations with China. Now, he's allowed to do this because he was such an advocate for anti-communism that nobody is going to question that he's opening up our relations with a communist country. We want to have a scientific and cultural exchange and have open markets. China is a massive market that could really buy American goods, and that we could have a big exchange there. He doesn't have to be worried about being labeled soft on communism, as I said, and he hopes to play the world's two largest communist countries against each other. If the Soviet Union, which isn't necessarily a big ally of China, even though they're both communist, if they see that China is going with the United States, they may be more likely to negotiate as well. So again, this idea of power politics, the three major countries, the United States, China, and Russia, we're trying to play China against Russia so that the Russians will come to the negotiating table. So this kind of works. We enter this period of what is called détente with the Soviets. Détente means relaxation of tensions. So we try to have a cultural and scientific exchange as well with the Soviet Union. There's less worry of nuclear war. They're going to sign nuclear test ban treaties, and they attempt to avoid any further third world conflicts, Vietnam or anything like that, between the United States and the Soviet Union, to try to calm down any tension we have with them. And we get real results out of this. So after visiting China, he visits Moscow, and we get trade and military agreements. As I said, we get a nuclear test ban treaty called SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and we hope to stabilize the arms race and lower defense costs. So Nixon knows that domestically we're having an economic problem, so we want to lower our arms costs, and we do the same thing for the Soviet Union. We also agreed to sell USSR surplus agricultural goods. From the U.S. perspective, it helps farmers by having another market to sell to. And you can also see there's little cracks in the Soviet Union already that they're looking for agricultural products because they're really not being able to provide their people with enough food. So it becomes a major issue. So this is one of the major achievements of the Nixon administration is he gets, the Soviets to the negotiating table, and he actually gets some real benefits out of it. However, on the downside, obviously Nixon is going to be taken down by the Watergate scandal. So we'll talk about some of the people involved, his Attorney General, his Chief Domestic Advisor, and his Chief of Staff, how they kind of all plan this eventual break-in. So there's an organization called the Committee to Re-elect the President, otherwise known as CREEP. In 1972, Nixon is going to run again against the Democratic candidates, and we're trying to get money to provide for the re-election of the president, but they also start to engage in some not legal things to get Nixon reelected. So Watergate actually refers to the hotel complex that's in Washington, D.C., and in June of 1972, the Democratic National Headquarters is there, and they break in and they're trying to steal any sort of documents that could be used against the Democrats. They bug the hotel, they put cameras, and they want some sort of financial benefit as well. So 5 men are arrested. Nixon is afraid, but he does eventually win against Senator McGovern. So at the time, he does not know about the break-in. This is all done without his knowledge. So eventually we start hearing other things in the newspaper about an enemies list. 200 plus FBI are told to discredit these people that Nixon doesn't like, IRS to audit them, the FBI infiltrates the Students for a Democratic Society, and the Black Panthers. So we start to see that Nixon is using his authority to go after people he doesn't like. Again, he doesn't know about Watergate. He's not necessarily involved in that, but he's doing other things that make him maybe seem less trustworthy. So here's where Nixon kind of gets involved. 2 of the burglars, Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, were employees of CREEP, and Nixon secretly approves $460,000 to keep them quiet about the Watergate break-in. Now he is covering it up. This is the actual crime, not necessarily the break-in, but the cover-up. So the Washington Post reporters help break the story about this Watergate story, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and eventually we get a trial in January of 1973 with the burglars, and they said that he admits he worked for CREEP, and there's issues with the money given to burglars, concealing the White House involvement. The Attorney General approved the break-in, and Nixon denies knowing anything about the break-in, which is true. He doesn't know about the break-in at the time it occurs, but now he's starting to really get into mistruth because at this point he does know that it happened because he helped pay to keep people quiet. So one of the big breaks in the Watergate scandal is when one of the White House aides, Alexander Butterfield, says that there are tapes in the Oval Office, that Nixon was very untrustworthy, and he bugs the entire Oval Office. So Nixon flatly refused to produce the tapes, claiming executive privileges, that obviously we need to be able to negotiate in good confidence, and eventually the United States sues the president to give up the tapes, and he does do that. While this is going on, Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew resigns because he is found guilty of income tax evasion and taking bribes when he was governor of Maryland, and he appoints a new VP, a man named Gerald Ford, who will eventually take over for him when he resigns. So what becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre, there's a man named Archibald Cox who was assigned to be a special prosecutor to figure out what was going on, subpoena tapes and other documents from the White House. Nixon ordered that he be fired. His Attorney General refused, so he resigns. The Deputy Attorney General refuses, so Nixon fires him, and the Solicitor General, one of the top lawyers in the country, finally agrees, and many see this as the president's attempt to block the legal process as proof of guilt. So they kind of already decided that he's guilty, and we eventually find out that he is. So Nixon tries to release transcripts only, not the actual tapes. The court orders him to give the tapes up, and there's an 18-minute gap in these tapes that says they were destroyed. His secretary, Rosemary Woods, said it was her fault they say that it was her fault that this 18-minute gap appears, and the House begins impeachment hearings to decide whether they're going to bring an impeachment trial against the president. So one of the tapes reveals that 6 days after the break-in, Nixon orders the use of the CIA to hold back an inquiry by the FBI. Obviously, this is obstruction of justice, and therefore he is guilty of again, the cover-up, not the actual break-in. So after Nixon resigns, we start to see the effects of Watergate, the disillusionment of the imperial presidency, of Nixon's presidency. We start to lose confidence in our government, again, with the Pentagon Papers going on as well. And we get the Freedom of Information Act, which gives citizens free access to files of the government they may have on